welcome to Fun Problems, the problems of fun. I'm Peter C. Hayward.
I'm AJ Brandon.
And today we're doing a mini-sode. AJ, what is a mini-sode?
Mini-sode's like a regular episode, but smaller and more orange on both our screens. Actually, Your beard matches my shirt, and my walls match your shirt.
Audio listeners, in case you haven't realized yet, we have a YouTube version of this now, and you can go and see what we're talking about on our YouTube. Today, AJ, I want to talk about a John Cusack film from the 80s.
I don't see what more it could have to do with board games. There's no explanation needed.
Today we're talking about Fidelity. Now, this is another Peter-led episode. I think we've done nothing but Peter-led episodes pretty much all year. What is Fidelity in this context? I haven't explained this to you, so I'm curious if you're on the same page as me without having to discuss it.
My guess is that fidelity would have to do with how close it is to the source material.
Oh, what a good definition. That is not at all what I meant. Fidelity is the level of give. I should have actually looked up a dictionary definition before recording, but it's too late now. So if something is high fidelity, there can be a lot of precision. If something is low fidelity, there's not. So high fidelity speakers are the ones where you can adjust the back speaker and the left speaker and all of them as intricately as you want. Whereas something low fidelity, like the lowest fidelity, is just a binary, it's on or it's off. In the context of board games, this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is why I want to do an episode about it. It is basically how high do your numbers go. So I just want to do a little mini-sode because I have thoughts on this and I assume that you will too once we get into it. There are advantages to using high fidelity and there are advantages to doing low fidelity. We have coming up our Daniel.Games blog, and in one of his blog posts, he basically says, lower your fidelity. Everything should be as low as possible. And that is definitely a strong starting place. Often, after my third or fourth draft of a game, I'll just go in and be like, cool, what numbers can I reduce? Can you think of an example of a game with high fidelity or somewhere in a game that has high fidelity and somewhere that has relatively low fidelity? Ideally in the same game. Here's the challenge for you.
Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? High fidelity and low fidelity in the same game is a little tough off the cuff. I can give you two similar examples, and that would be
please.
Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! This was very formative for me because when I was a kid, I played Yu-Gi-Oh! And then all the attack numbers are 25,000.
Yeah.
And then I pulled up the first I pulled up the first Magic card. And I was like, "What do you mean it has one attack?"
6. That's a high attack to you? I've done over 5,000.
Yeah, 6 is a very high attack in Magic. And I remember
that is
initially
a great example, by the way.
And initially, when I was playing, I had that same shock of this just seems weird, seems so small. And as soon as you start having to do any calculations, you're like, oh, thank God these numbers are small.
Yeah. The example I was thinking of a very high fidelity game would be 18xx games or anything where you're dealing with stocks and shares will typically have multipliers in the tens or the hundreds where in a train game, a company can have 10 shares, and each of those shares can be worth $12,000, and now suddenly you've got 120. It gets crazy high. An example, I don't know of a published game that does this, but I'll describe the idea, and you'll probably be able to think of one. An example of a game with high fidelity would be something like 6 Nimit, where the numbers range from 1 to 60, but the number of skulls or bull's heads, whatever they are, on a card is only 1 through 3, typically. Right. So that's an example of what I would call low fidelity and high fidelity in one very clean system.
I guess another example could be Lost Cities. Lost Cities, the cards just range 1 through 10, but then the scoring is multiplicative as well, or can be at least. You could end up multiplying it 2, 3, 4 times, I think is the highest it goes.
Yeah. So high fidelity and low fidelity. When to use each. So as Daniel.Games would say, try to aim for low fidelity. But there are definitely the advantage of low fidelity is exactly what you're saying, which is that the math is easy. At the end of the game, if I'm adding up my points and I'm 4 plus 3 plus 2, I can do that. If it's 160 plus 275 plus 981, I'm pulling out a calculator.
It also is a good way to emphasize differences. If you go from having 2 attack to 3 attack, that feels like a big deal.
Yeah.
And so it can make it makes all changes in the system feel significant.
Yeah. The disadvantages, and this is a mini-sode, so we're just gonna whip right through this, AJ. We're just gonna bang, bang, bang. There's two major ones that I can think of, and please tell me if you think of more. The first is that you have less fidelity. You have less ability to like make subtle differences. So exactly you said, the difference between 2 and 3 is so big that if you're like, oh man, 3 is too powerful and 2 is too weak, now you're adding another mechanism in. Now you've got to change something else. This is particularly relevant with costing. If I have only cost 1, 2, and 3, then and I want the cards to be balanced to those numbers, they're just probably not going to be. Like, it's probably going to be impossible. If I can cost something from 1 to 100, I can fine tune that as much as I want. Now, most of the time you don't want to do that, but it is a useful tool. There are definitely times when I'm like, I don't have the fidelity to like do this. I'm just going to have to increase the cap and adjust the numbers accordingly, and it just gives you that breathing space and lets you kind of do more nuance or fidelity.
And this is nice where you can have games that have what were called knobs, where it's like you can tune things and you have more than one knob to tune. The most simple example would be you don't just have the attack of the unit, you also have its cost. How much does it cost? How strong is it? But then you have health, then you have abilities, and if you have non-numerical abilities, you can do a lot of different things with that. But you're right, if you're in a spot where all you have are the numbers because that's the type of game you're making, it can definitely put you in a tight spot where you need to have some amount of granularity to be able to work with, for sure.
Yeah, traditionally, my cards don't have costs. I very rarely make a game with costs. Normally it's co-designs because I just don't think in terms of costs. So Village Pillage, there's, God, between the expansions, 80 cards now. They all cost 1 turnip. All of them. And that really limits the design space in some ways. What are you going to say?
I was just going to say, but how many different cards you can get out of that system? Like, I think listeners would be impressed if you taught them just the core rules and you said you had that many cards. They'd be like, "How? How is that possible without having?"
It's not numbers? With the core rules. Each expansion adds something that lets us like open up a whole new wing of design space. But yes, generally speaking, very proud of that. And so that is an example of the lowest fidelity of just a flat 1 number. But on those cards, we have so many other knobs where we have the number of turnips you gain, the number of turnips you lose, the number of turnips you steal, the number of turnips you bank, there's 4 different things that you can go against, and you could give, we've never done all 4, but you could theoretically do a different effect against all 4. Within Village Pillage, the merchants are one of the 4 suits. They do the same thing no matter who they're against, and so they're sort of lower fidelity again. And not coincidentally, they are the hardest to design. I'm sort of using fidelity in a more obscure way to mean like design space, but I think it's still useful. So yeah, it's not a coincidence that there are the fewest merchants and they are the most similar, just because we cut a bunch of design space when making those.
Mm-hmm.
The other huge, and this is I think the more relevant one, disadvantage of low fidelity is ties. Now, this is most obvious in victory points. If during the course of the game you only get 1, 2, or 3 victory points, almost every game's going to end in a tie. Let's be honest. Like it's just going to be tie. Whereas something like 1830 or Indonesia, where your score is going to be somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000, you're not going to tie. Like there's probably a tiebreak in the rule, but it probably comes up 1 in every literally 1,000 games. Like it's just not a thing you really have to worry about.
Yep. I was just going to add to that. I've got another disadvantage of low low fidelity games.
Granularity is a totally valid synonym, by the way. Fidelity is just what I think of it as.
Yep. And sorry, I've always thought of it as granularity, so we're going to go back and forth, folks, but just try and know that we're saying the same things. I think skill expression is a very real thing.
Oh, yeah.
If you have very similar point values for, let's say you're doing a Euro game with recipe fulfillment, right? And all your point values are pretty similar, then everyone's scores are going to be pretty similar at the end of the game. And it's nice to have different amounts of points because you have higher amounts of fidelity so that players can find the path through the system that gives them the biggest benefit. I was working recently with a co-designer who's also a listener to the podcast, shout out Stefan. And he and I found that in our first pass, all of the cards had 2 similar scoring, and everyone's points were just between like 2 or 3 of each other pretty consistently, as long as you're competent players. But then we made the points significantly more different. It ranges from 2 to technically could go up to 10 for the cards, and then the scores ended up being quite different because you could see people who are really good at the game being able to find the path through the system that benefits them the most.
Yeah. So specifically in the context of victory points, one thing about low fidelity, even separate to ties, is that it can feel wrong. And this is a bit of a weird one. This is like a taste thing. Critter Kitchen has numbers in it. There are numbers in Critter Kitchen. Spoiler alert, I hope you weren't opening the box hoping not to know that. Basically, you serve up these numbered ingredients to the critic, and then you get points equal to those numbers. So if I serve 2 7s and a 6, that's 20 points. Did that right off the top of my head. Very proud of that. And in our original game, that was it. So you would score between, like, I don't know, 180 and 210, and it was too much. Like, for a game of this weight, it was too much. So our developer, Chris Strain, actually added in this great star system. And originally, he had the stars convert to victory points at the end. And we went, wait, why don't we do the opposite and have the victory points convert to stars? Each star is 5 victory points. So now instead of a score of 140, I've got a score of 28. And that felt right for this game. I've had the exact same thing happen in the opposite direction, where I have had a game where, like, you finish the whole game and you're like, cool, I got 6 points, you got 7, you got 8. And even if there's no ties, it's just like, really? We played for an hour and a half to get to 7? It just feels wrong. So that there is a feeling component to fidelity, specifically in the context of victory points, that I think is really psychologically interesting, and worth looking up. Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the feel of the numbers is one of the most important things. The feeling of low numbers is that they aren't significant. So if you have a low scoring game, it's not going to feel right. If you have low numbers for your stats, it might feel like they're weaker. Higher numbers might require more calculation, but they do offer you a bigger feeling because intrinsically in our monkey brains, it's just like, ooh, this number's really big. I know 5,000 gold is a lot of gold in real life.
There's games like Castles of Burgundy, not Castles of Burgundy, the Castles of Mad King Ludwig, where the currency is just got a 0 added to the end. The minimum unit is 50. So it's technically like you could divide everything in that game by 50, but it would feel wrong. And in this case, it's because it's literally like currency, and we know how currency works. But there is this weird thing of, like, it's 50, 10, 100, etc., instead of 1, 2, 1, 5, etc.
I think a very good cheat is for things where it would feel weird to have very small numbers, but you want small numbers, is to use high numbers with, like, the zeros off to the side. I was playing the estates, and it's like every one of these bills is 1, but it's not $1. It would feel wrong to be like, I'm buying this house with $1.
Yeah.
Each one is then 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0.
Yeah.
So you get the benefits of both.
Do this with an M too, like just make it millions.
Totally.
I don't know what For Sale does, but it's something like that, where it's just like, yeah, look, this has got zeros on the end. Just
I think it's thousands. I think every number is like 1,000,
right.
2,000.
That was before the housing bubble, so now it would be millions.
Yeah, seriously.
The outhouse would be 7 million. Okay, let's talk about high fidelity numbers. So the advantages is all the counter stuff to the disadvantages of the low fidelity numbers. Gives you more room to play, gives you more flexibility. The big disadvantage is the obvious one that we discussed, but it's definitely worth mentioning again. And this is, which is simply that. Sorry, I'm very caffeinated. I don't know if you can tell. I'm all like.
God's energy.
The big disadvantage is that it's more complex, and I think this is one of those things that once you start looking for it, it's there way more than you think. There's a really excellent episode of Board Game Design Lab with, I think his name's Daniel Peterson. He used to work at Indie Boards and Cards. No, Daniel Peterson? I can't remember. Anyway, we'll find a link and put it in the show notes. And I clicked through being like, okay, what's this going to be about? And then, like, it stuck with me for 8 years or whatever it is. And the episode is how to remove numbers from your game. And he does a really good job of being like, yeah, don't give people 3 action points. Have a card that says move any number of spaces in a straight line. And it is stunning what a difference that is. Like, one is that you're sitting there counting stuff. Like, I think it was specifically how to remove counting from your game. He's like, I never want to count.
Yeah.
And I really, like, we'll link to it. I really recommend this episode because, like, once you know some of these tricks, you will find how good it is to apply it. But the thing about high fidelity is that it can creep in subtle ways. I have a game called Tiny Folk Cafe I've been working on. And originally, when you serve a customer, you would get either $2 or $3. very low fidelity. And then you would buy artifacts. Artifacts cost either $1, $2, $3, $4, or I think $5. I halved the numbers in this, and it made the game so much better. This was already... I felt like this was as low fidelity as you can go. I changed the 2 and the 3 to 1 and 2, and I made like the artifacts cost 1, 2, and 3. It's such a subtle difference. Like, it sounds stupid, but it really made a difference, because you might serve 5 customers in a round, and having to go like 2, 2, 3, 3, 2 is so much more annoying than 1, 1, 2, 2, 1. It's staggering what a difference it makes. So, go ahead.
It's not just a difference of how complex it is to like calculate. Oh, I'm 4 spaces away from this, target or whatever, those kinds of things. But it's also consistency. If the numbers are flatter, it's more consistently the same numbers, which is much easier to do in a lower fidelity game, because you just are using less numbers naturally, and you don't have the granularity to be like, oh, this one goes 5, this one goes 6, this one goes 7. Instead, you go, most things are 2 and some things are 3. It makes it much easier for players to be able to remember all the different numbers and keep everything in their head, because there's a lot less of it to keep track of.
Yeah. I'm actually going to go into Tiny Folk a little bit more, because I think it's interesting. At the end of the game, I had the classic every $3 is worth a point. With the new system, I said every dollar is a point. Like, they turn into points 1 to 1. With the old system, I think artifacts were worth different number of victory points. Under the new system, they're all worth 1 point. You can spend $5 for an artifact, and it'll be worth 1 point at the end. So you're spending it for that ability, and it's up to you to evaluate whether that ability is worth it. So amateur designers especially, no flame to amateur designers, we love you, are obsessed with balance. This is like the starting point for a lot of people, is like, my game's got to be balanced. And the thing about balance is not only that it's illusion, but also that whatever the rules of the game are, that's what players are going to play to. I could have said, look, this artifact is... I did, in fact, say, this artifact's a little bit weaker, so I'm going to make it worth 1 more victory point. Or I can say, look, it's worth 1 victory point, and it's up to you as a player to decide, is that worth it to me? The earlier in the game you get it, the more chances you get to use it. And so, like, maybe in round 2 you don't ever buy it, but you'll always buy it in round 1. That's a strategic point now. It's not unbalanced.
Imbalances are interesting. It is interesting to be able to look at something and say, oh, you know what, this thing that's up for buying right now is less good than the normal thing. Maybe I'll go do something else, and some other sucker will buy it, and I'll come back later.
Yeah. So the disadvantage of high fidelity, firstly, is complexity, and we had Jeff Fraser on years ago. This podcast has been running for years, AJ. And I believe in that episode he talked about his rule. You actually interviewed him, so you might remember better than I, which is that he never has 1s in his games. He always goes 2, 3, 4, because the difference between 1 and 2 is so much bigger than the difference between 2 and 3. And so, like, 1 to 3 is triple, 2 to 4 is only double. And so that has been my starting point for a lot of games, and I think a lot of times it does work. The counterpoint is Daniel.Games says, if you don't have a 1 in your game, your numbers are too high. I think these are both really valid opinions. I'm not trying to say one is better than the other. I am leaning more and more towards lowering the numbers anywhere and everywhere that I can. If I could, never publish a game with a number higher than 5, I'd be a happy boy. Not literally, but like that's sort of the platonic ideal of like everything is lower and then it fits in people's heads better. And they're not playing the math, they're playing the game.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, it's kind of a cheat to be able to say things like, you can go any number of spaces in a straight line. If in your game that max number is 5, well, okay, you could have just said you can move up to 5 or whatever, but instead by just saying go in a straight line, it's more exciting to players, I think. It's less complex to them, and it's a more unique ability as well.
Yeah. I want to talk about another prototype I've been working on. This is what inspired the episode, actually. It's with a local designer called Matt, called working title is Gods and Men. We're definitely going to rename it because that's a terrible title. And the gods are playing this little game of cards. It's sort of like a 6 Nimid inspired game. And the cards are numbered 1 through 30. You play a card, you all reveal, whoever plays I won't go into the mechanics too much, but basically if I play a red 4, I am adding some control to the red space. If you play a 7 blue, you're adding control to the blue space. First time we played, we just had the control be equal to the number that you added. Cool. I played a 4, I added 4 control. You played a 26, you added 26 control. you can immediately see the issue with the fidelity in this. In fact, AJ, can you explain the issue with the fidelity in this, just so we're completely crystal clear?
Well, adding 26 of a thing requires A, if nothing else, a lot of tokens. B, if you have 26 of a thing on there, then you add more to it, then you're going to have to be adding together all these different things that are just piling. That's nightmarish.
And then thirdly, the 4 is meaningless. Like,
right.
Who cares that I played 4? I might as well have played nothing. Like, it doesn't matter. So that's one of the big traps of high fidelity, is that it can just make everything seem pointless. Like, if the gap is... And similarly, like, actually, to go back to victory points, if at the end of the game I have 4 points and you have 80, that's... I don't care what the game is. That feels terrible. I have a game with Amigo, the publishers of 6-Nimit, and they came back and they were like, hey, players are winning by too much. And I was like, interesting. Like, this is not a problem for me, but I completely I think it's a valid point, especially for Amigo, who do a very specific kind of flavor of game. You don't want to lose by 60 points if your total score was 80. Like, it just feels so rotten. You're not going to play that game again. What we ended up doing is, and I want to move into a kind of a general advice section starting with this, is we said, okay, everything from 1 through 10 has one control. 1 through 5 has one control, 6 through 10 has 2, etc., etc. And then we realized even that was too high fidelity, and we made it 1 through 5 has one control, 5 through 10 has one control and a tiebreaker, and then so on and so forth. And it just meant that the numbers capped out at 5. And like I said, if I could publish 5 or less for the rest of my life, we needed the fidelity of the big number. So like if I played 26 and you played 27, we couldn't have ties. The game wouldn't function if there were ties. So we needed that fidelity. But rather than do the sort of, I think, naturally elegant thing of being like, this number is everything, adding that second lower fidelity number, I think, really benefits the game. Totally.
I think similarly, there's games what was it, Navigador, that I was just playing, where you've got, or maybe it's Nucleum, maybe it's both of them. I've been playing a lot of yours recently, and they all kind of blend together in my head. But these games where you have like refreshes, where you get a bunch of workers or whatever resources, and in these games, you upgrade how many things you get, but it's not linear. It's not every single time you upgrade, you get one more thing, because then you're going to upgrade this 10 to 20 times over the course of the game. You don't want to be getting 20 workers
slimming
per
and
thing.
Stuff,
Yeah. So instead, it goes 1, 1, 1, 2, and on some of those spaces, it goes 1, 1, 1 with a victory point 2, something like that, where it's like you can keep the numbers low and still give players something. And note that victory points are something where you're able to, I think, get away with having higher fidelity in general, where you can get more of those things and it's less big of a deal. Whereas having too many resources, I think, is way worse, because something you have to count. How much do I have? How do I use this strategically? All those sorts of things. It occupies way more of your mental space than just going up a victory point track.
Yeah. This might be a whole episode of itself, so I'm just going to briefly touch on this and move on. But I've been thinking a lot about video game to tabletop adaptation lately. I've been working on some projects, and this is a key part where fidelity matters so much. I've been playing Balatro. I don't know if you've played that.
I have, but I'm not really into poker, so I bounced off it.
I very much fell in love with it. You'll see several Balatro inspired projects coming out from me soon. Without going into too many details, that game has multipliers, and then you can multiply the multipliers. So like a hand can be worth 140 times 26 times 2 times 2 times 1.5 times 1.5 times 2. In tabletop, you would die. Like that's just going to be like the advantage of video games is obviously that the computer can do the math. But this has made me think a lot about like fidelity. How do you take that same escalation and scale it down so that humans can do it?
Man, I have so much to say now that you open up the can of worms of video games. I'm gonna try.
We'll do a video game episode.
I'm gonna try to go very quickly. Well, no, I'm gonna say a few things, but it's all on topic. So, Slay the Spire is one of the few roguelikes that I have gone into because the numbers are so small. And again, it's actually really interesting to look at that as an example, because in the board game development, which I hear is absolutely phenomenal, I've looked it up. I haven't played it myself, but it looks really, really impressive.
I want to play it, but it's hard to get your hands on.
Yeah. But yeah, the numbers in the video game were like 5 to 10 or whatever. But then you can do things that will multiply them. But again, it's fairly simple, and in that one, it's important to have moderate numbers because you need to have a variety of different numbers and effects and stuff. But you also need to have it be calculatable because the exact numbers that you need to hit are really important. If an enemy has 43 HP, you better be able to count to 43 because otherwise, like, you could just be wasting damage, or you could accidentally undershoot by 1 and then you lose. So even though the computer's doing the math for you,
I'll
it still
interrupt to
matters.
say that, like, Balatro just doesn't care about your feelings. Balatro is like, by the end, it's like, okay, this one costs 200 million to defeat. You're not going to calculate that. There's no button that's like, hey, how much will this hand score? It's just like, hope you do it. It really leans into like, we're not gonna make this easy for you. You can't. It's incalculable. Like, it's technically you can sit at the calculator. No one's ever going to. Instead, what you'll do is you have 4 hands, so you'll play a hand and be like, okay, this is about that range. This hand should be a bit more than that. It's quite fun. Sorry, continue. I cut you off.
No, you're good. You're good. But yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting case study of taking a video game to a board game and seeing what they had to do to the numbers to make it work. So everything is way condensed. 6 becomes 1, those sorts of things. They cap a lot of different abilities to not multiply too crazy. But then the other example is a video game that's very much Slay the Spire inspired, and it's called Monster Train. Have you heard of that one?
I've heard of it, yeah. I'm on a roguelike run at the moment,
Sure.
so I've heard of a lot of these, and they're in my queue.
So Monster Train's pretty cool. The pertinent part of this discussion is you have, like in Slay the Spire, your deck gets better and better, and your cards get upgraded, and you can do some crazy busted stuff, just like Slay the Spire. But the ramp,
all of this
the
applies to
escalation-
Balatro too, by the way.
Sure. But the escalation in Monster Train is crazy. At the start of the game, you're fighting enemies with like 5 to like 40 health. By the end of the game, you're fighting people with hundreds or thousands of health. It's like insane. But what I really like about what I think is really valuable to this conversation is there are still enemies with 5 or less health. So your starter card that just does 1 damage but does it anywhere could still be very relevant later in the game,
fun.
which is super
That's really
interesting.
cool. Okay, we've talked about high fidelity, we've talked about low fidelity, we've talked about John Cusack. What can designers do to make this general theory into actionable advice?
I think we've touched on a lot of things. I think the main thing is, like a lot of our episodes, just being cognizant of it. More and more as we go into advice, I feel less and less prescriptive and more descriptive of just describing what the problems are, what things to be aware of, and just make these conscious decisions in your design. If you think that you need to have high fidelity, just do it consciously with thoughts to how much cognitive overload it's putting on the players in addition to the rest of things that are going on. Where possible, try and keep your numbers lower if players are going to have to interact with it, or if players are going to have to use the numbers involved in their strategy. If I have to, one thing that's pushed me away from a lot of heavy Euros is you have to calculate a specific set of stuff you're going to need many turns in advance. I am going to need 10 wood, 3 sheep, 4 brick, and 2 wheat 5 turns from now. Okay, now I have to get those exact things in order. If you're going to make players, if you're going to punish players for not reaching that goal, or if you're going to heavily reward players for reaching a specific goal that they have to strategically plan for a long way in advance, then you should make those numbers manageable for them, because that's where it's going to really compound the issues that we're talking about. Whereas something like TI is a bit more flexible, where it's like the resource you care about is just resources. Maybe it's straight goods. Yeah. So it's like you have to have 10 goods, and there's only that one thing. So you can look at that number 10 and not have to overwhelm yourself with too many things, even though it's like a moderately high number because you're getting 1s and 2s from different places. It's just one type of resource, so it's not compounding the issue of having multiple different high numbers of things that you're keeping track of.
Yeah. I will say that, I worry that I'm going to sound prescriptive now. I think of less as being prescriptive and more of just like, here are tools that you can use.
Sure. Yeah.
I guess that there's 2 sides to it. This is now the philosophy of philosophy. There's lenses and there's tools, as far as I'm concerned. Lenses is a way of seeing problems or seeing things in a way that you wouldn't have before, and then tools are a way to address stuff that needs fixing. So some tools that I've been really heavily leaning on is stuff like I mentioned with the Gods and Men game, which is like, if firstly I try to reduce the fidelity as much as possible, and then to make the difference between 1 and 1 is I can add the tie-break token, which is effectively a half, but it doesn't feel like that because it's a physical token that you take and put in front of you, and you're like, I now break ties of this color. If you're handing out resources and you're like, man, these both need to hand out resources, but this one needs to be slightly better, make one of the resources into a wild resource or a resource of the player's choice. Like, they're still both 3 resources. If you have resources in your game, give them a hierarchy. I used to avoid this. It drives me nuts now to look at my old games and be like, man, Peter, you really didn't want anyone to like have an easy time, did you? Century Spice Road is the obvious example where there's literally like the least to the most, and they're very carefully like arranged. But most games will have some kind of like hierarchy of resources. So in Sunshine City, glass is the least valuable because the least places accept it. Gold is a wild, so that's the most valuable. But science, everyone wants science, so science is more valuable. Despite the fact that you can go to any of these locations and get one of them, by giving them that hierarchy, then you can say like, okay, I'm going to give you 3 resources, but 3 glass is very different to 3 science, is very different to 2 glass and a science. You're still keeping the numbers low, but now they have relative sort of non-numerical fidelity.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that leads into the knobs, right? Where it's like you've effectively added a knob to a resource by saying it's wild. It now has one extra meaning to it.
Yes. That's a really good way of putting it. Let's say that. Rather than rely on numbers for your knobs, see where else you can find them.
And another interesting one is that goes along with that point is that you can just change the number of resources in the system. If you're drawing cards from a deck, maybe there's just fewer of the thing in there. And so if you have something that lets you search for that, it's much more valuable.
Yeah. Magic the Gathering, you brought up an example of a game with low fidelity, and thinking about it, it's low fidelity on all fronts. Like, a card that costs any more than 5 resources is a very, very, very expensive card. The numbers on that game go up to like 6 reasonably maximum. There are exceptions because there's 12,000 cards. But as a rule, like, you could play 100 games of Magic the Gathering and never see anything with more than a 6 on it anywhere. And then what they do is they add the knobs of keywords. They have so many keywords, but like trample, suddenly it's an orthogonal. It's a perpendicular like way of adjusting the power, which is, adds to the richness and the fun of that game.
And I think looking to knobs makes the game way more interesting too, because a card that has 3 attack versus a card that has 2 attack, like, okay, yeah, the 3-1's better. But a card where it's not super clear, it's very interesting for players to have to figure out if it's incomparable, right? If you have one creature who's got the ability of flying and then a creature with the first strike ability, which one of those is better? It's kind of situational. It's kind of up in the air.
It's not 5 versus 6. It's now this versus that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just going to say, another example for Magic is 2 mana for a counterspell. They tried that, and it was way too good for most formats. 3 mana for counterspell was way too slow. So what you see is a lot of 2 mana counterspells with a downside. It's not fully counterspell, it's counterspell unless, or counter a specific type of spell. And then the 3 mana counterspells is counter a spell plus. And that makes the game a lot more interesting. If 3 was the perfect number, then I think it'd be less interesting. Or if 2 is the perfect number, but because it lies somewhere in between for that one effect, it gives them a lot of design space.
I'm going to touch on high fidelity because I feel like we've been shilling pretty hard for low fidelity, and I just want to explain that we're not paid by the lobbyists.
By big fidelity.
By small fidelity. The huge advantage of high fidelity is that, for me, the biggest advantage is that it eliminates ties. And I think anytime you're running into an issue in your game where there's people tying, whether that's in combat or in priority order or this or that, fidelity is a really useful tool where you can just be like, cool, for this particular thing, I'm just going to double the numbers. Now, obviously, if your systems are interconnected, that can be a problem. But if it's literally just like a priority thing, make those numbers as high as you like. Critter Kitchen has a lot of priority stuff, but we only have numbers 1, 2, and 3. So there is a whole tie-break system in that game that if, we instead made it that I have 1, 10, and 30, 1, 10, and 20, and you have 2, you know what I mean? Like there's ways that we could have completely avoided fidelity ever being an issue, ties ever being an issue, had we gone in a high fidelity direction. It's not right for that game, but it's a tool that is worth keeping in mind if you're running into a tie problem.
Ooh, look at this, listeners. We get a rare AJ and Peter disagree.
Oh.
So I think that certainly can be the case. Like if you're looking at something like the Mind. The Mind has 100 cards, 1 through 100. There is no tie. But if there's still the possibility of a tie, even if you make it less likely, you still need the edge case of the tiebreaker, right? Unless I misunderstand what you're saying.
So I mean, one way to do it is to hit fidelity to the point where everything has a unique number.
Yeah.
So I guess that's arguably more about uniqueness than high fidelity, but I would still say like a game where a tie happens 1 in every 500 games is different to is way better than a game where it happens on average 3 times a game.
It depends. It depends on how central the tiebreaker is. Like in Rising Sun, the tiebreaker is like such a focal part of the game.
Right. If it's a core mechanism, that's different. Yeah. But in Village Pillage, the buying order was least turnips, and that's average fidelity, like 1 through 10. And so we had to have this whole chicken tie-break system. But
I hear what you're saying. If I can, I'm going to restate and see if I understand you correctly. You're saying it makes ties happen much less likely, or much less often, and ties are, generally speaking, not something that players are going to feel as satisfied with as one person clearly beating the other in one way or another.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Essentially, if it's costless, which is always advantage, but it's a tool. It's a tool where if it's costless or low cost. So, for example, let's say we're making a game where at the start of the round everyone plays a card face down and flips it, and you go in number order. Even if those cards are doing a dozen other things, I would split the number order off and just make that unique. Like, give me even if there's 200 cards in the deck, cool. They're numbered 1 through 200. You could even number them 10 through 2000, and then when you do an expansion, you've got that extra space in between.
I've seen that before.
Yeah, I really think it's not literally costless, but it's pretty close to costless for something like that where it's pure priority. And if it allows you to eliminate or like footnote a tiebreak, cool, do that. I make a lot of simultaneous action games, so I'm constantly running into tiebreak problems, and I'm increasingly leaning into fidelity as a way of combating that.
I almost never make simultaneous games. Not really into them, so that explains why it's more on your mind than mine.
Very much on my thing. Anything else on fidelity?
I think we covered it.
Oh, yeah, you want to have a quick bit of fun?
Sure. Do you have a fun question prepared?
I do have fidelity? A fun question. Not about fidelity. My fun question is, what do you like to do on your birthday?
I don't celebrate my birthday. I don't do anything.
Really?
Really.
You hate fun that much?
I haven't had a birthday party since I don't even know when. I would have been like a young teenager, maybe.
Is this why you cry so much?
It has a little something to do with it. More the entire planet falling apart. But let's not get into things here.
Mostly the birthday thing.
I will say that now that I moved away from a lot of people to Aurelia away from Toronto, I think I'm going to start having birthday parties, mostly as an excuse to get people to drive to me.
Yeah.
But it's really just for that. It's not because I care about my birthday at all.
I love birthdays. I'm a cartoon character, so birthdays are very big for me.
Oh, you like it when you're the center of attention, huh?
I know.
I never would have
Shocking,
guessed.
Isn't it? My birthday is today. My girlfriend's birthday was... Oh, thank you. What a weird coincidence that I brought up a fun question in such a way that you had to wish me happy birthday. My girlfriend's birthday was yesterday, and my best friend's birthday is the day before, so we have a little birthday club.
I don't think my birthday's yesterday.
Did you say yesterday? Because that's my girlfriend's.
I was hoping you weren't going to call me on it. I realized as soon as I said it.
And so I like getting my free Starbucks, because if you're a Starbucks member, you get a free Starbucks on your birthday, and spending time with my loved ones. And I buy myself a little something, because I am pretty frugal otherwise. And so today I bought a computer monitor, because mine has been turning off just often enough that I don't have to buy a new one, but I really want to buy a new one.
Right. Perfect time for a birthday present.
Yes, exactly. Cool. We don't do teasers anymore. Although we could, because we're literally about to record the next one.
Actually, it might make sense. So we're about to do a YouTube exclusive one. Sorry, audio listeners, but what we're going to be doing is reviewing my sell sheets, or rather, Peter is going to review my sell sheets, and that doesn't really make sense in an audio format because you can't see them. So tune into.
We might. It depends on how it goes. We might release it by audio, but probably not. So if you were really excited by the idea of AJ crying that we mentioned earlier, definitely check that one out.
Yeah, Peter's not going to hold anything back. He's just going to tear me anyway.
I've been asked not to, just to be clear. Thanks so much for listening. We have an outro, so I don't even need to say that. But that's all from us this week. Bye!
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter at FunProblemsPod, or reach us via email at funproblemspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and if you enjoyed the podcast, please tell a friend.